Here is the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer.
Will join an otherwise evenly divided court and immediately obtain the ability to affect the laws of the United States and the rights of its citizens for generations to come. Enormously important issues hang in the balance: the right of workers to organize, the pernicious influence of dark money in our politics, the right of Americans to marry whom they love, the right to vote. Two issues of similar and profound consequence are the fate of the affordable health care and a woman's freedom to make the most sensitive medical decisions about her body. These two rights, affordable health care and a woman's freedom to make sensitive health care decisions, hang in the balance with this nominee. The views of President Trump's next court nominee could very well determine whether the Senate approves or rejects this nomination. Now, President Trump has already made up his mind. President Trump has repeatedly said that he believes Roe was wrongly decided. He has promised in his own words to nominate only pro-life judges, whose selection will result in the automatic overturning of Roe v. Wade. Those are his words. Pro-life judges, automatic. He also said that Chief Justice Roberts has been an absolute disaster, his words, for voting to uphold the health care law, and said his judicial appointments will, quote, do the right thing, unlike Bush's appointee John Roberts on Obamacare, unquote. It is near impossible to imagine that President Trump would select a nominee who isn't hostile to our health care law and health care for millions and millions and millions of Americans, who isn't hostile to a woman's freedom to make her own health care decisions. We can be sure of this because President Trump, during the campaign, asked Leonard Leo, the founder of the Federalist Society, to assemble a list of possible Supreme Court justices for him to pick from. Mr. Leo was not only aware of candidates' Trump preference for a Supreme Court that would reverse Roe v. Wade, he himself spent his career in pursuit of it. And that's not just my view. According to Edward Whalen, one of the most prominent legal conservative activists and scholars and bloggers, said, quote, no one has been more dedicated to the enterprise of building a Supreme Court that will overturn Roe v. Wade than the Federalist Society's Leonard Leo. No one has been more dedicated to overturning Roe v. Wade than the very man who chose the list of 25. That's what we're up against here. And that's why America is on tenterhooks, so worried about any choice from this list. Let me repeat again. Mr. Leonard Leo is the man who assembled Trump's list of potential Supreme Court nominees, and no one has been more dedicated to overturning Roe v. Wade than Leonard Leo. Now, normally in the Senate, we have a process of advise and consent on the Supreme Court. In the old days, the president would consult with Republicans and Democrats in the Senate on a qualified judge, and then, after careful deliberation, nominate a jurist that could get bipartisan support. What we have here is the exact opposite. The president has gone to two far out of the mainstream hard-right groups, the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society, and asked them, not the Senate, to advise and consent on a Supreme Court nomination. Whomever the president selects tonight, if that nominee is from the pre-approved list selected by Leo and the Heritage Foundation, everyone ought to understand what it means for the freedom of women to make their own health care decisions, and for the protection for Americans with pre-existing conditions. Those rights will be gravely threatened. Mr. President, Now, we're going to hear a lot this summer about precedents. The traditional question on these matters has been, will the nominee defer to precedent? Nominees will be asked if they respect settled law. This is known as the principle of stare decisis. The nominee always answers that yes, he or she will respect and defer to precedent. And senators nod their heads, having received this rickety, vague assurance that the nominee will not rock the judicial boat and turn the clock back decades. But for two reasons. This standard, settled law, stare decisis, is no longer an adequate standard by which to judge nominees. Why? Well, first, we have ample example from the past several years of judges who have sworn in their confirmation hearings to respect precedent and then reverse their stand once on the court. For example, in his confirmation hearings, then Judge Gorsuch said that, quote, precedent is like our shared family history of judges. It deserves our respect, unquote. Last week, just last week, now Justice Gorsuch voted to overturn 41 years of precedent in the Janus decision, relying on flimsy and fabricated legal theory. It was so flimsy, in fact, that Judge Kagan wrote in dissent that the majority overruled precedent, quote, for not exceptional or special reason, but because it never liked the decision, subverting all known principles of stare decisis. Justice Roberts, another person who swore he would obey precedent, he said he'd call balls and strikes as he saw them, rather than interpret law. Justice Roberts said he would call balls and strikes as he saw them, that he would interpret law rather than make it. Of course, it was Justice Roberts who was then responsible for overturning 40 years of precedent in the Citizens United decision that so set back our politics, that so deepened the swamp that so many Americans despise by allowing huge amounts of dark money, unreported, to cascade into our political system. On two of the most important rulings in the history of the Roberts Court, a cumulative 81 years of precedent were thrown out the window, despite the earnest promises of Justices Roberts and Gorsuch at their hearings. So when they say they'll obey settled law, you can't believe it. You can't believe it, because it just hasn't happened in this new conservative court that is so eager to make law, not interpret it. And there's a second reason, maybe even more important, why the principle of, quote, I'll follow settled law no longer works. And that's President Trump. We already know that President Trump's nominee will be prepared to overturn the precedents of Roe v. Wade and NFIB versus Sebelius. We know that because President Trump has said so. When the president has a litmus test for his nominees and only chooses from a pre-approved list of nominees designed to satisfy that litmus test, it is certainly not enough for a judge to prove his or her moderation by invoking stare decisis. Stare decisis and respect for precedent have become an almost meaningless bar to set for a Supreme Court nominee. At this critical juncture, with so many rights and liberties at stake, U.S. senators and the American people should expect an affirmative statement of support for the personal liberties of all Americans from the next Supreme Court nominee. The American people deserve to know what kind of a justice President Trump's nominee would be. President Trump is the one who made the litmus test for his nominee, not us. The onus is on his nominee to show where he or she might stand. considering the ample evidence that President Trump will only select a nominee who will undermine protection for Americans with pre-existing conditions, give greater weight to corporate interests than the interests of our citizens, no matter what precedent says, and vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, the next nominee has an obligation, a serious and solemn obligation, to share their personal views on these legal issues, no matter whom President Trump selects tonight.